Betrayal in the Sky. Female pilot's affair with Dubai Sheikh leads to shocking revenge. True crime. A hook. Captain Emily Ross had always been a woman of control. Her hand steady, her mind sharp. She was a seasoned pilot, her reputation pristine. But there was something about Sheikh Tark that unnerved her. The power he exuded, the way he moved in the room, like he owned it all. Their affair had started innocent enough. A few stolen glances in first class, then private dinners in hidden corners of Dubai's most luxurious hotels. A shared moment of whispered secrets. But soon, those quiet nights turned into reckless days. In the opulent world of gold and silk, Emily lost herself. Tark's passion burned like fire, and she couldn't resist. She knew it was dangerous, but she let herself fall, deeper and deeper into the world of wealth and secrecy. The flight was routine. The air was calm. Emily's hands gripped the controls, but her mind was elsewhere. Her thoughts drifted to Tark, his touch, his words, his promises. She had no idea what was coming. The sudden cough behind her made her heart race. Her co-pilot, Daniel, was pale, his face drawn with sweat. "Are you all right?" she asked, concern creeping into her voice. But Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he looked at her, his eyes wide with panic. And then it hit her. The smell. A sickeningly sweet, metallic odor filled the cabin. Emily's throat tightened. Her stomach churned. She didn't need to ask to know. Daniel was sick. His condition worsened with each passing minute. The plane's cabin grew heavier, the air thick with tension. She tried to focus on the instruments, but everything fell off. Her mind raced through 1,000 thoughts, none of them good. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice hoarse. It was him, Tark, he rasped. Emily froze. Her heart skipped a beat. What was he talking about? Daniel's eyes locked onto hers, pleading, terrified. "He gave it to me," he whispered. A sharp, cold realization hit her. It wasn't just an illness. It was revenge, HIV, and it was now spreading like wildfire. Daniel's body was succumbing to the virus, and there was no cure. Her mind spun, the room tilting as the truth set in. Tark had used her, toyed with her emotions, and now it was Daniel's life on the line. The realization burned like ice through her veins. She wasn't sure who had been the true victim all along, but the consequences were clear now. There was no escape. Not for her. Not for Daniel. Not for anyone. The plane felt suffocating now. The walls closing in. Emily's breath came in short, shallow gasps. She tried to steady her hands on the controls, but they were trembling. Daniel's labored breaths filled the cockpit, each one sounding more desperate than the last. She could see his face pale, the sweat pouring down his forehead, his body shaking uncontrollably. Her mind screamed at her to act, to do something. But what could she do? Tark had left his mark on them both, a cruel reminder of what she had allowed herself to become a part of. Daniel let out a strangled cough, his chest heaving with each breath. Emily's heart pounded against her ribs. She glanced at him, her co-pilot, her friend, and her mind began to unravel. How could she have been so blind? Tark had never cared about her. She had been a pawn, an object in his twisted game of power and revenge. And now Daniel was paying the price for her mistake. The radio crackled, a voice cutting through the tension. It was air traffic control. "Captain Ross, are you receiving? Captain Ross, do you copy?" Her hands shook as she reached for the mic. "Yes, we copy," she muttered, her voice barely a whisper. "Captain, do you require assistance?" the voice asked, calm but insistent. Emily closed her eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Her co-pilot's life was slipping away with every passing second, and she couldn't save him. She had failed him. I need medical support," she said, her voice cracking. "Roger that, Captain," the controller replied. "Help is on the way." The silence that followed felt suffocating. The hum of the engines was the only sound. Daniel's body continued to tremble beside her, his breath shallow and uneven. She wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but nothing would change what had already happened. The feeling of betrayal, of being used, gnawed at her. And in that moment, Emily knew that she would never be able to escape the past. Tarek's shadow loomed over her. Even now, the revenge was far from over minutes past, but it felt like hours. The air in the cockpit grew thick with dread, the silence between them almost unbearable. Emily's hands gripped the controls tighter, the smooth hum of the engines now sounding like a distant echo. Daniel's breaths were ragged. She could hear him struggling, fighting against the sickness that was consuming him. Her heart ached for him. He didn't deserve this. But as much as she wanted to help, she knew she couldn't. The virus had taken hold too fast. The needle had been planted, the seed of destruction. And now Daniel's body was paying the price. She glanced at the radar, trying to focus, trying to hold it together. But her thoughts kept returning to Tark, the Sheikh she had once trusted. Had she been a fool? No, she wasn't a fool. She had been manipulated, and now she had to face the consequences. The betrayal stung like an open wound. The radio crackled again, interrupting her thoughts. "Captain Ross, we are sending a medical team to your location. Prepare for a rapid descent." The voice was calm, professional, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that it was too late. She looked at Daniel once more, his eyes glazed over, barely conscious. He couldn't hold on much longer. And then, without warning, a violent cough racked his body. A dark, wet sound. Emily's stomach twisted. He wasn't going to make it, but there was nothing she could do. The thought settled deep in her bones, suffocating her. Her thoughts were spiraling, and her mind, once so sharp, now felt clouded. The door to the cockpit creaked open behind her. A figure stepped in, causing Emily to snap her head around. Her blood ran cold. It was Tark. His presence in the cockpit was like a nightmare made real. He stood there, tall and imposing, his dark eyes fixed on her. And for the first time, she saw no warmth, no charm, only cold, calculating menace. "Emily," he said softly, the sound of her name like a whisper of death in the thick air. "Did you think you could escape the consequences?" Her throat closed up. She couldn't speak. His smile was like a dagger, twisted and cruel. "You used me," she managed to croak. Tark's eyes darkened, a flicker of amusement in his gaze. "You were never meant to escape," he said, stepping closer. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. He had planned this all along. Everything, the affair, the power play, the revenge, it had all been part of his sick game. And now, as Daniel's life slipped away, Emily realized the full extent of his cruelty. Her betrayal wasn't just hers to bear. It was a consequence that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Tark's shadow loomed large, and the price was far steeper than she had ever imagined. The air felt suffocating now, the weight of Tark's presence heavy in the cockpit. Emily could barely breathe as he stood there, his gaze never leaving her face. Her heart raced, the pulse hammering in her ears. She looked at Daniel, whose body was still racked with tremors. He didn't have much time left. Tark's eyes flickered toward Daniel, then back to Emily. "You didn't think it would end like this, did you?" Tark said, his voice low and menacing. Emily's stomach churned. Her mind was spinning. How had she let this happen? Her eyes flickered to the emergency radio. If she could just get to it, maybe she could send a message, call for help. But Tark seemed to anticipate her every move. Before she could make a move, he stepped forward, his presence looming, blocking her way. "Don't," he warned, his voice like ice. She froze, her hand hovering over the radio. He stepped closer, So close she could feel the heat of his body, smell the sharpness of his cologne. Her breath caught in her throat as his fingers brushed against her arm. "I've already won," he whispered, his lips brushing her ear. His words sent a chill down her spine. He wasn't just playing a game. This was a carefully calculated act of destruction. She was nothing but a tool to him, a piece of his revenge. "Let him go," Emily found herself saying, her voice shaky. Tark smirked. "He was never part of the plan," he said. "You were." Her heart clenched, her chest tightening in fear. She had fallen for him, allowed herself to be consumed by his world of luxury and allure. But she had never seen the monster beneath. Daniel let out another ragged cough, pulling Emily's focus back to him. The air in the cockpit was thick with despair. She felt the heavy weight of guilt settle on her shoulders. "Tark, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't you see what you've done?" But Tark just laughed, a dark, mocking sound that made her skin crawl. "I see exactly what I've done," he said coldly. "And you will, too, soon enough." He turned, walking toward the door. The sound of his footsteps felt like a hammer to Emily's chest. Her mind was reeling, but all she could focus on was the crumpled form of Daniel, the life slowly draining from him. She couldn't let him die like this. But in that moment, with Tark's cruel words hanging in the air, she knew there was nothing she could do. The Sheikh's revenge was final, and she had played her part unknowingly in the destruction of everything she held dear. The darkness of the cockpit pressed in on her, and in the silence that followed, she realized the full cost of her choices. It was too late now that Tark's footsteps echoed down the hallway as he disappeared from the cockpit, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts, and the devastation unfolding before her eyes. Her mind raced, each moment feeling like it stretched into eternity. Daniel's breaths were becoming more labored, his body jerking with each violent cough. She had no power to stop this. Her hands were trembling, sweat running down her forehead as she tried to maintain control of the plane. But the weight of the situation, of Tark's betrayal, of Daniel's suffering, was too much. Emily turned her gaze back to Daniel, her chest tightening as she watched him fight for air. She could hear the slow, desperate rasp of his breathing, a sound that chilled her to the core. She had to do something. She had to fix this. But her thoughts were clouded. The virus had taken hold too quickly, and there was no saving him now. She gripped the controls tighter, trying to focus, to push through the panic gnawing at her insides. But the cockpit was spinning, the walls closing in. Her heart raced. Her thoughts kept returning to Tark, his cold smile, his whispered words. How could she have been so naive? How had she not seen the darkness hiding behind his charm? She had thought she was in control of her own life, but now her every decision felt like it had been manipulated, twisted. A game she didn't even know she was playing. Daniel's body gave one final violent shake. His eyes fluttered closed, and Emily knew. She whispered his name, but it was too late. A cold knot formed in her stomach as the full weight of her helplessness settled in. Her hands slowly released the controls, and she stared down at her co-pilot, the man who had trusted her. But there was no undoing what had been done. The virus, Tark's revenge, had done its work. The plane felt like it was falling apart, its one steady hum now a distant sound in her ears. The emergency lights flickered, her head swam, and for a moment she could almost hear Tark's voice again, taunting her, reminding her of her role in all of this. The smell of metal and sickness filled the cabin, overwhelming her senses. She had thought the worst was over when she first saw Tark's face. But now, with Daniel's body slumped beside her, Emily realized the horror was only beginning. There was no escaping it. Tark's revenge would haunt her forever. The weight of Daniel's lifeless body beside her felt like a crushing burden, pulling at her every thought, every breath. Emily sat frozen, the cockpit eerily quiet now, save for the steady hum of the engines. But the silence was suffocating. Her heart thudded in her chest, a dull thump, like a death march. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Every part of her wanted to scream, to shatter this suffocating stillness. But the shock kept her paralyzed. She wanted to scream at Tark, to beg for forgiveness, to make him undo what he had done. But the man was a ghost now, vanishing into the shadows of her broken life. It was clear there was no way out. The cockpit felt more like a tomb than a plane. Her mind was spinning, but each thought felt like it was dragging her deeper into a black hole. Her fingers twitched, yearning for the controls, but every movement felt wrong, every breath a weight she couldn't carry. Suddenly, the intercom crackled to life. The voice from air traffic control was distant, almost irrelevant, as if it came from another world. "Captain Ross, we are preparing for your landing. Please confirm your coordinates and descend at once." The words felt like a cruel mockery. She couldn't respond. She couldn't even think clearly enough to try. Her eyes darted to the flight panel, the instruments mocking her with their blinking lights, their steady beeps that had once reassured her, now meaningless. Her stomach churned, a tight knot of dread building. Tark's revenge wasn't over. It never would be. Her hands were still, her mind still too fogged to make a decision. She had to land. She had to land the plane no matter what. The clock was ticking. She knew it was coming. She couldn't hide from it anymore. But there was a part of her, buried deep inside, that couldn't help but wonder, had Tark left something else behind? Her breath caught. There was a thin, dark thread of suspicion crawling through her mind. He was too calculating, too clever to leave something like this moment unfinished. Had he done something else? Something even worse? Emily's eyes flickered over to Daniel's body once more, her pulse quickening. What if he had done more than just spread the virus? The thought made her stomach flip. The intercom buzzed again, but it was drowned out by the growing panic in her chest. She gripped the yoke tightly, feeling the sudden weight of the world on her shoulders. Her palms slick with sweat, her hands shaking. The realization hit her. This was no longer just about revenge. Tark had left her with a ticking time bomb, and she had no idea when it would explode. The threat was inescapable. Her skin prickled. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong, something far worse than she had ever imagined. And the worst part, she didn't even know how far Tark had planned to go. The plane lurched slightly, the turbulence sharp and sudden, throwing her back into the present. Her heart skipped a beat, and her eyes snapped back to the flight instruments. There was no time left to waste. She had to make a choice. But all Emily could think of was how she had been played, how her own blind trust had led to this nightmare. And now, there was no way to undo the damage. The plane shuddered again, this time more violently. Emily's hands tightened on the controls, but her mind was still racing, tangled in a mess of fear and confusion. The reality of the situation was too heavy, too real. She couldn't afford to fall apart, not now. But every breath felt like it was being stolen from her. Her heart pounded as the turbulence shook the plane, a reminder that there was still a job to do. She had to land, but where? Her eyes darted to the window, the endless desert stretching out beneath them, dark and vast. No one could help her. She was alone in this, alone with Daniel's body, alone with the twisted aftermath of Tark's game. The voice from air traffic control crackled again, sharp and insistent. "Captain Ross, please respond. We are unable to reach you. Do you need assistance?" Her fingers moved almost on their own, her grip slackening for a moment, before she forced herself to respond. I'm fine," she whispered, but the words felt hollow, empty. They were anything but fine. The truth twisted in her gut. This wasn't just about surviving the flight anymore. It was about facing the wreckage she had helped create. Tark's revenge wasn't just physical. It was psychological. He had broken her, brought her to the edge of madness. And now, as she faced the barren emptiness of the world below, she realized the full depth of the trap she had walked into. It wasn't just Daniel's life that had been stolen from her. It was her own. Her thoughts snapped back to the cockpit. The emergency landing procedures. Her hands trembled as she pulled the yoke gently, trying to steady the plane, trying to focus on the task at hand. But every movement was slow, deliberate, each second dragging longer than the last. She looked at the instruments. The altimeter read lower than it should be. Her heart skipped a beat. Her mind flashed back to the last time she had checked the fuel levels. It had been hours ago, but she knew something was wrong. She couldn't be certain, but the sinking feeling in her stomach told her everything she needed to know. The plane was losing altitude too quickly. Her grip on the yoke tightened. She had only minutes. "Come on," she muttered under her breath, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. Her thoughts were frenzied now, each passing second a weight on her chest. Tark had orchestrated all of this. Every twist, every turn, every moment of weakness, every ounce of trust she had given him. He had planned it all. And now, it felt like the walls were closing in around her. The plane lurched again, the sound of its descent growing louder, more ominous. Emily's knuckles were white, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She couldn't lose control. Not now. Her eyes scanned the horizon, but there was nothing, only the endless stretch of sand. The harsh reality hit her again. She was too far out. There would be no safe landing. Her heart raced as the air grew thinner, the pressure mounting. She glanced at Daniel's body, his final moments flashing in her mind. The guilt burned through her, every decision that had led to this moment. Her mind screamed for a way out, but all she could hear was the sound of Tark's words, his laughter in the back of her mind. He had won, but now she had to finish this. There was no going back, and with the desert stretching endlessly before her, Emily knew one thing. This wouldn't be just a crash. It would be the end of everything. The descent grew sharper, the air around her vibrating with the whine of the engines struggling against gravity. The control panel flickered, lights dimming. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears. Her mind was a storm, thoughts colliding. Tark's betrayal, Daniel's death, the haunting certainty of the crash. She had to make a choice. Her hands gripped the controls, every muscle in her body taut with fear. But the weight of the situation was like a heavy chain around her neck. She could feel the pull of the earth beneath them, the inevitable crash growing closer. The desert stretched out below, vast, empty, and unforgiving. Where was help? Who could help her now? Her fingers moved mechanically, flipping switches, trying to engage the autopilot, but it was too late for that. The altitude was dropping too fast. She closed her eyes for a split second, trying to steady her breathing. She couldn't focus, couldn't think clearly. Her mind kept going back to Tark, his cold eyes as he walked out of the cockpit. Was he still out there watching, waiting for the final act of his twisted play to unfold? Her stomach clenched at the thought. The voice of air traffic control crackled again, distant, frantic. "Captain Ross, you need to initiate emergency descent immediately. You are off course." Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't have time for this. The desert loomed closer. The edges of her vision darkened, and the pressure in her chest built, as if the plane and the weight of her guilt were crushing her together. She glanced at the fuel gauge again. Empty. Her chest tightened, her throat closing up. Tark had planned this, too. She had never stood a chance. The engine sputtered, a horrible, gasping sound that made her blood run cold. The plane was no longer under her control. It was falling, spiraling into the nothingness below. She could feel the air thickening, the wind whipping through the small cracks in the cockpit. Her breathing became shallow, erratic. The world outside blurred, the ground rushing closer, a dark void. The cockpit felt like a coffin now, each second a countdown to the inevitable. Her mind raced for any solution, any way out. But there was no way back, no escape. Tark had taken everything, her trust, her life, and now her future. With one last desperate push, Emily pulled back on the yoke, her fingers locked in place, but the plane refused to respond. The desert was closer. It was happening. And then, as the final moments of her descent drew near, a strange, calm clarity washed over her. The chaos in her mind quieted for just a second. She had failed. She had been a pawn in a game she never understood. But now it was over. The desert was closing in. The realization hit her. This was no longer just about revenge. Tark had left her with a ticking time bomb, and she had no idea when it would explode. The threat was inescapable. Her skin prickled. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong, something far worse than she had ever imagined. And the worst part, she didn't even know how far Tark had planned to go. The plane lurched slightly, the turbulence sharp and sudden, throwing her back into the present. Her heart skipped a beat, and her eyes snapped back to the flight instruments. There was no time left to waste. She had to make a choice. But all Emily could think of was how she had been played, how her own blind trust had led to this nightmare. And now, there was no way to undo the damage. The plane shuddered again, this time more violently. Emily's hands tightened on the controls, but her mind was still racing, tangled in a mess of fear and confusion. The reality of the situation was too heavy, too real. She couldn't afford to fall apart, not now. But every breath felt like it was being stolen from her. Her heart pounded as the turbulence shook the plane, a reminder that there was still a job to do. She had to land, but where? Her eyes darted to the window, the endless desert stretching out beneath them, dark and vast. No one could help her. She was alone in this, alone with Daniel's body, alone with the twisted aftermath of Tarek's game. The voice from air traffic control crackled again, sharp and insistent. "Captain Ross, please respond. We are unable to reach you. Do you need assistance?" Her fingers moved almost on their own, her grip slackening for a moment, before she forced herself to respond. I'm fine," she whispered, but the words felt hollow, empty. They were anything but fine. The truth twisted in her gut. This wasn't just about surviving the flight anymore. It was about facing the wreckage she had helped create. Tarek's revenge wasn't just physical. It was psychological. He had broken her, brought her to the edge of madness. And now, as she faced the barren emptiness of the world below, she realized the full depth of the trap she had walked into. It wasn't just Daniel's life that had been stolen from her. It was her own. Her thoughts snapped back to the cockpit, the emergency landing procedures. Her hands trembled as she pulled the yoke gently, trying to steady the plane, trying to focus on the task at hand. But every movement was slow, deliberate, each second dragging longer than the last. She looked at the instruments. The altimeter read lower than it should be. Her heart skipped a beat. Her mind flashed back to the last time she had checked the fuel levels. It had been hours ago, but she knew something was wrong. She couldn't be certain, but the sinking feeling in her stomach told her everything she needed to know. The plane was losing altitude too quickly. Her grip on the yoke tightened. She had only minutes. "Come on," she muttered under her breath, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. Her thoughts were frenzied now, each passing second a weight on her chest. Tark had orchestrated all of this. Every twist, every turn, every moment of weakness, every ounce of trust she had given him. He had planned it all. And now, it felt like the walls were closing in around her. The plane lurched again, the sound of its descent growing louder, more ominous. Emily's knuckles were white, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She couldn't lose control. Not now. Her eyes scanned the horizon, but there was nothing, only the endless stretch of sand. The harsh reality hit her again. She was too far out. There would be no safe landing. Her heart raced as the air grew thinner, the pressure mounting. She glanced at Daniel's body, his final moments flashing in her mind. The guilt burned through her, every decision that had led to this moment. Her mind screamed for a way out, but all she could hear was the sound of Tark's words, his laughter in the back of her mind. He had won, but now she had to finish this. There was no going back, and with the desert stretching endlessly before her, Emily knew one thing. This wouldn't be just a crash. It would be the end of everything. The descent grew sharper, the air around her vibrating with the whine of the engines struggling against gravity. The control panel flickered, lights dimming. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears. Her mind was a storm, thoughts colliding. Tark's betrayal, Daniel's death, the haunting certainty of the crash. She had to make a choice. Her hands gripped the controls, every muscle in her body taut with fear. But the weight of the situation was like a heavy chain around her neck. She could feel the pull of the earth beneath them, the inevitable crash growing closer. The desert stretched out below, vast, empty, and unforgiving. Where was help? Who could help her now? Her fingers moved mechanically, flipping switches, trying to engage the autopilot, but it was too late for that. The altitude was dropping too fast. She closed her eyes for a split second, trying to steady her breathing. She couldn't focus, couldn't think clearly. Her mind kept going back to Tark, his cold eyes as he walked out of the cockpit. Was he still out there watching, waiting for the final act of his twisted play to unfold? Her stomach clenched at the thought. The voice of air traffic control crackled again, distant, frantic. "Captain Ross, you need to initiate emergency descent immediately. You are off course." Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't have time for this. The desert loomed closer. The edges of her vision darkened, and the pressure in her chest built, as if the plane and the weight of her guilt were crushing her together. She glanced at the fuel gauge again. Empty. Her chest tightened, her throat closing up. Tark had planned this, too. She had never stood a chance. The engine sputtered, a horrible, gasping sound that made her blood run cold. The plane was no longer under her control. It was falling, spiraling into the nothingness below. She could feel the air thickening, the wind whipping through the small cracks in the cockpit. Her breathing became shallow, erratic. The world outside blurred, the ground rushing closer, a dark void. The cockpit felt like a coffin now, each second a countdown to the inevitable. Her mind raced for any solution, any way out. But there was no way back, no escape. Tark had taken everything, her trust, her life, and now her future. With one last desperate push, Emily pulled back on the yoke, her fingers locked in place, but the plane refused to respond. The desert was closer. It was happening. And then, as the final moments of her descent drew near, a strange, calm clarity washed over her. The chaos in her mind quieted for just a second. She had failed. She had been a pawn in a game she never understood. But now it was over. The desert was closing in. There was no escape from the nightmare she had helped create. And as the plane plummeted toward the earth, Emily finally understood what Tark had been waiting for. The true price of her betrayal. And the cost of revenge. The desert stretched out below, an endless sea of sand that swallowed the horizon. In the cockpit, time seemed to slow, each second dragging like an eternity. Emily's grip on the controls loosened, the weight of her failure too much to bear. She could see it now, everything. The past, the lies, the choices. Tark had woven his web, piece by piece, and she had walked straight into it, too blind to see the danger. Her mind was a fog, but somehow there was a flicker of clarity. She had thought she could control the plane. She had thought she could control her life. But now, all of it was slipping through her fingers. The wind howled outside the cockpit, the turbulence worsening, the engines sputtering in their final breaths. The ground was close. Too close. Emily's pulse raced as the plane pitched downward, the roar of the air growing deafening. There was no escape. And yet, a strange peace settled over her as the chaos continued to spiral out of control. In her last moments, she saw it clearly. She wasn't alone. Daniel's ghost seemed to haunt the cockpit, his pale face reflecting her own sense of hopelessness. She had failed him. She had failed herself. And now, the final reckoning was here. As the ground rushed up to meet them, Emily closed her eyes. There was no fear anymore, just the quiet surrender to what had already been written. But then, a violent shock jolted her body awake. The plane slammed into the sand with a deafening crash, the impact shattering the cockpit around her. For a moment, everything was a blur, metal, dust, a violent explosion of sound. Her body was thrown forward, her seatbelt pulling painfully against her chest. The world spun wildly, the cockpit breaking apart, the windows shattering in a shower of glass. And then silence. The hum of the engines was gone, replaced by the distant, eerie calm of the desert. Emily's eyes flickered open, her vision blurry, her body aching from the violent crash. She was alive. Somehow she was alive. But the pain was unbearable, every inch of her body screaming in protest. She tried to move, but her arms felt heavy, her head swimming with dizziness. She glanced around the cockpit, the remnants of the plane scattered in every direction. There was no sign of Daniel, no sign of Tark. Her heart skipped a beat. Was he watching? Had he planned this too? But there was no time to dwell on that now. She had to get out. The plane was wrecked, the emergency exits blocked by twisted metal. She had to escape before the fire reached her, before the desert swallowed her whole. Her hands fumbled with the seatbelt, finally managing to release it. She pushed herself up, her body protesting every movement. Outside the cracked windows, the vast, barren desert stretched endlessly. The horizon seemed so far, so unreachable. She had survived the crash, but for how long? The reality hit her like a punch to the gut. She was stranded in the middle of nowhere, alone. No one knew where she was. No one knew what had happened. And now, the true test began. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about the reckoning that was still waiting for her in the silence of the desert. The echoes of her past mistakes. The true price of revenge. And the slow, painful realization that, for the first time, she was completely, utterly alone, that Emily's breath came in shallow gasps as she crawled from the wreckage, her body bruised and battered. The harsh desert sun beat down on her, but it felt almost distant, like an oppressive force she could barely feel. Her limbs were numb, her vision blurry, but she forced herself forward, inch by inch. The wreckage behind her was a twisted mess of metal and shattered glass. The fuselage was barely recognizable, but in that twisted heap, there was no sign of Daniel. No sign of anyone, for that matter. Her heart tightened. Had they all? No. She couldn't think about that now. The desert stretched before her, its vast emptiness swallowing everything in sight. She stumbled, falling to her knees, the weight of everything crashing down on her. The pain, the loss, the endless betrayal. Tark's shadow lingered, taunting her from the edges of her mind. Had he known? Had he planned for her to survive just long enough to face this? The thought made her stomach twist, but she couldn't linger on it. She had to move. She had to survive. The sand beneath her palms felt rough, like it was pulling her down into the earth, urging her to give up. But Emily gritted her teeth and pushed herself to her feet. The heat pressed against her skin, her throat dry as dust. But she couldn't afford to stop. There was no one coming, no rescue, just the endless desert and the haunting silence. Her breath was ragged as she took a step forward, then another. Each movement felt like she was dragging herself through quicksand, but she refused to stop. Tark had won. He had made her feel helpless, trapped in a game where the rules were always shifting. But there was one thing he hadn't accounted for: her will to survive. Emily knew what she had to do now. She had to keep moving. She had to get out of this desert no matter the cost. The sand dunes ahead seemed endless, a vast sea of emptiness that stretched into oblivion. But somewhere in the distance, she could see the faintest outline of something. A mirage? Or a sign of hope? Her heart quickened as she squinted against the blinding sun. It was a shape, a silhouette. A building? A road? Her mind raced, but she didn't dare hesitate. Every step felt like it could be her last, but it was better than staying still. Better than succumbing to the despair that threatened to swallow her whole. She pushed herself harder, dragging her body through the suffocating heat, focusing on the shape in the distance. Was it real, or was it just another trick of the desert? With each step, the figure seemed to grow closer. It was real. The hope surged in her chest as she forced her legs to move faster. But something in her gut told her it wasn't just the desert playing tricks. Her mind raced again. What if this was the next phase of Tark's plan? What if she was walking right into his trap? The thought stopped her for a moment, but only for a moment. She couldn't stop. She couldn't look back. Her survival depended on this. And so she pressed on. The figure ahead grew clearer, darker against the bright horizon. It was a structure, a building of some sort, its edges jagged, like it had been abandoned long ago. But it was real. It had to be. With a renewed sense of purpose, Emily pushed her aching body forward, her legs weak but determined. As she neared the structure, her heart raced faster. Her vision blurred from exhaustion, but she could see the shape clearly now. It was a small, dilapidated outpost, the remnants of some old settlement, its walls cracked, its windows long shattered. It was hope, fragile as it was. But as Emily took her first step toward it, the harsh desert wind picked up again, and with it, a low rumble from somewhere deeper in the sand. Her body froze. Was it an echo? Or something else? The air was thick with tension, the ground beneath her feet shifting, as if the desert itself was alive. And in the distance, just beyond the outpost, she thought she saw another figure. A man standing still, waiting. Tark? She froze, the desert air sharp in her lungs. No, it couldn't be him. She wasn't ready to face that nightmare again. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there watching. And Emily realized she wasn't alone anymore. And the desert, the vast emptiness, wasn't finished with her yet. Her heart pounded in her chest, the thudding sound deafening in her ears as she stared at the figure standing in the distance. It was too still, too unnatural. She blinked, trying to clear her vision, but the figure remained motionless, almost as if it were waiting for her. Was it Tark? Had he found her already? No, it couldn't be. She wouldn't let it be. Her instinct screamed at her to run. But her legs were like lead, too stiff from exhaustion and the brutal heat. The sun was an unforgiving presence in the sky, beating down relentlessly. But her focus was locked on the figure. It hadn't moved an inch. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, everything around her fading into a blur, leaving only that silhouette. Was it real? Was she hallucinating? The wind kicked up again, swirling the sand around her feet in a dizzying dance. Her throat was dry, her body begging her to stop, but she couldn't. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. With every step she took forward, the figure remained, locked in place, like a sentinel. Was it a trick? A mirage? The idea that it might be another part of Tark's twisted plan flashed through her mind. Maybe it was a trap, set to lure her in. Maybe this was his final game, playing out in the middle of nowhere, with no one to hear her scream. She felt a cold chill run down her spine as the figure started to move, slowly, deliberately. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface erupted in full force. Her breath hitched, and she stumbled backward, her hand flying to her side. But there was nothing. No weapon. No defense. The figure was getting closer now. Each step was deliberate, measured, like it was testing her. But as it neared, the truth hit her in a rush. It wasn't Tark. It wasn't anyone she recognized. It was a man, but his face was hidden beneath the shadow of a tattered hood, his clothes ragged, worn. He moved silently, almost as if he were part of the desert itself. His movements were so fluid, so unnatural, that for a moment she wondered if he was real at all. The closer he got, the more she realized just how wrong everything felt. His presence was unsettling, too still, too perfect in his quiet approach. Emily's body screamed for her to run, but her legs betrayed her, frozen by the strange pull of the man. And then he stopped. No more steps, no more movement. He just stood there watching her, his hooded face obscured, but she felt the weight of his gaze pressing down on her. His presence was heavy, unnerving. Her voice trembled as she finally managed to speak. "Who are you?" she demanded, the words feeling small against the vast silence of the desert. The man didn't answer at first. He simply tilted his head, a slow, deliberate motion, and then he took a step closer. "Lost," he rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper, like the desert wind itself. So very lost. His words chilled her to the bone. She stepped back instinctively, but the man didn't follow. He remained where he stood, staring at her, his face still hidden in the shadows of his hood. "I can't help you," she said, trying to steady her breath, trying to find any trace of courage in the face of this new terror. His eyes were the only part of him visible now, and when he met her gaze, it felt as though everything inside her stilled. Those eyes were empty, hollow, like the desert had swallowed everything human about him, leaving only an echo of what had once been. "You can't escape," he whispered again, his voice trailing off as the wind began to howl once more, picking up strength. The world around her seemed to shift in that moment. The sand swirled violently, pushing against her skin, her clothes, the air thick with dust and decay. She staggered, disoriented, her senses assaulted by the unnatural force of the wind. But the man remained unmoved. He didn't flinch. And then, in a flash of eerie clarity, Emily understood. This wasn't a man. This was something else. Something that had been lost to the desert long ago, and now it was waiting for her, waiting to pull her into the same suffocating emptiness. The very air around her felt thick, oppressive, like the weight of the desert itself was pressing down on her. With a final glance at the figure, Emily's survival instinct kicked in. She couldn't stay. She couldn't let the desert claim her like it had claimed so many before her. With trembling legs, she turned and bolted, running as fast as she could, her breath ragged and frantic. The wind howled louder, but she didn't stop. The figure didn't follow, but somehow it didn't need to. Its presence was imprinted on her mind now, and that alone would haunt her. Long after she'd outrun it, Emily's feet pounded against the sand, each step harder than the last, the desert stretching endlessly before her. Her lungs burned as she gasped for air, the dry heat choking her with every breath. The figure, whatever it was, still lingered in her mind, its hollow eyes locked on her with an intensity that refused to fade. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching, that the desert itself was alive, waiting for her to stumble, waiting for her to falter. She pushed harder, running without thinking, only the sound of her own heartbeat filling her ears. The sun was relentless, beating down from a sky that felt like it was closing in on her. But she couldn't stop, not yet. Her legs felt like lead, and the sweat that soaked her clothes didn't cool her. It only made her feel more weighed down, more trapped. She dared not look back, but the feeling of being pursued, of being hunted, was suffocating. The ground beneath her was unforgiving, each step sinking slightly into the dry sand, adding an extra layer of resistance. The world around her seemed to blur, everything bending in the heat of the sun, until it all became one vast, never-ending expanse of beige and brown. Her thoughts became fragmented, jagged, her mind as erratic as her breath. Where was she going? What was the point of all this? She couldn't answer that. She couldn't think. The only thing that mattered was putting one foot in front of the other, moving forward, away from the eyes that had pierced into her very soul. But with every step, the air grew heavier, thicker, the wind stronger, swirling around her like a living thing, pushing her, pulling her. Her vision blurred again, the sweat stinging her eyes, her body trembling with exhaustion. The landscape around her had started to shift. What had once seemed like a flat, endless desert now had subtle contours, slight changes in the terrain that hadn't been there before. A ridge, a shadow, a faint, looming shape in the distance. It shouldn't be there. It shouldn't be possible. But there it was, unmistakable against the endless horizon. A structure, a building, the same one she had seen earlier, the outpost that had seemed like a distant hope, a mirage on the edge of her sanity. But it wasn't a mirage. It was real. Her heart leapt in her chest, a burst of adrenaline surging through her as she focused everything on reaching it. The figure, the desert's haunting presence, was fading behind her, lost in the heat and dust, but the thought of it, of whatever it was, still gnawed at her. She didn't care. She didn't have time to care. The structure was close now, closer than before, and with it, the possibility of safety, of answers, or at least something. As she neared it, she could see that it was even more dilapidated than she had first thought. The walls were cracked, and windows had long been shattered, but it stood, a testament to something long past. She pushed herself faster, staggering toward the entrance. Her body was breaking, each muscle screaming in protest, but she couldn't stop. Not now. When she reached the entrance, she collapsed against the frame, barely able to stand. Her breath was ragged, and her knees buckled beneath her as she staggered into the shadow of the building. Inside, it was cool, a strange, hollow chill that seemed to seep into her bones. The air was thick with dust, but there was something oddly comforting about it. Her eyes adjusted, and she realized she was in a small room, its walls lined with crumbling stone, the remnants of some long-forgotten place. She looked around, desperate for anything, water, a way out, anything that could make her feel like she wasn't completely alone. But there was nothing, just emptiness, and then a sound. It was soft at first, just a whisper of a noise that made her freeze. She looked around frantically, but there was no one. The room was empty, and yet the sound came again, a faint scraping, a slow, deliberate movement. Her pulse quickened. Her mind flashed back to the figure in the desert, the emptiness, the whispering voice. Her body was already moving before she could stop it, her feet carrying her toward the source of the noise, her breath shallow, erratic. The sound grew louder, closer. It was coming from a doorway at the far end of the room. Her hand trembled as she reached for the frame, her mind screaming for her to turn back, but she couldn't. She had come this far. The door creaked open, the sound scraping against her nerves as she stepped inside. And then she saw it. A figure hunched over, its back to her, its hands scraping across the ground. It was the same figure, the one from the desert, but now it wasn't standing. It was crouched, hunched like an animal, its movements jerky, unnatural. And as it turned, its face came into view. It was the man, but his features were twisted, distorted, like he had been carved from the desert itself. His eyes were wide, too wide, black pits that seemed to devour the light. And he was smiling. "Lost," he whispered again, his voice sending a chill through her. "So very lost." The words echoed in her mind, filling her with a terror that felt like it was crawling under her skin. Her breath caught in her throat, her legs freezing in place. The figure reached out toward her, its hands clawing the air like it was reaching for something or someone. And in that moment, Emily understood the truth. The desert had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many before her. And now, there was no escape. The figure's hand reached out toward her, its fingers twitching like they had a mind of their own. Emily's breath hitched as she took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. The air around her felt thick, with an unseen presence, suffocating her as if the very walls of the room were closing in. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She couldn't move, couldn't run. The weight of the figure's gaze pressed down on her, and the darkness of its eyes seemed to draw her in. "Lost!" The figure rasped again, its voice a low, distorted whisper that sent chills down her spine. "So very lost." Emily's chest tightened, her fingers trembling at her sides. She knew she had to move, but her body wouldn't obey. She felt trapped in the haunting stillness, every instinct screaming at her to escape, but there was nowhere to run. With every step it took toward her, the room seemed to grow colder, more oppressive. The distant howl of the wind outside was muted now, replaced by the strange, eerie hum that filled the space. The walls seemed to shift, their crumbling stones warping like the air itself was alive with some dark force. In a flash, she snapped into action. She bolted toward the door, her legs finally obeying. But as her hand gripped the frame, she realized something terrible. The doorway was no longer a path to freedom. It was an entry into something far worse. Her heart pounded in her chest, terror clawing at her throat as the door began to close on its own. She was being swallowed into the dark. "Help me," she gasped, her voice cracking, but there was no one. The figure stepped closer, its twisted form growing larger as it reached out, its arms stretching unnaturally long, fingers curling toward her. And then, just as her fingers brushed the door's edge, the room tilted. The ground beneath her feet shook, sending her sprawling to the floor. With a deafening crack, the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. And in the sudden silence, Emily's heart stopped. The figure was gone, but something much worse remained. The room was still. Too still. Emily's pulse echoed in her ears, the thrum of her heartbeat, the only sound in the suffocating silence. She slowly rose to her feet, the world around her a haze of dust and shadows. The door, once a lifeline, was now nothing but a wall. Her legs trembled, her mind still reeling from what had just happened. Had the figure been real? Had it been part of her descent into madness? She wasn't sure, but something in the air had changed. The oppressive weight of the desert seemed to press down on her more heavily than ever. It wasn't just the heat now, it was something deeper, darker, something that had seeped into the very fabric of the earth. Her breathing steadied, and she began to move toward the center of the room, her gaze shifting to the cracked walls, the broken windows. Everything here felt abandoned, forgotten, as though it had been waiting for her. Then, the smallest noise, barely a whisper, caught her attention. A shift in the air. She turned, her heart racing again, only to see nothing. Nothing except the sense of a presence, a pressure in the air that she couldn't explain. Her mind swirled with conflicting thoughts. Should she stay and wait for rescue? Or keep moving, pushing forward, hoping to find her way out of this nightmare? But then she remembered. She remembered the look in the figure's eyes, the hollow emptiness. It wasn't just watching her. It had known her. It had known her past, her mistakes, her fears. It had been waiting for her all this time.